That's kind of cool though. No, I think we'll full name it.
Okay. At first, I thought you were being sarcastic because last time I said your last name wrong.
Did you?
But I said Dr. Barbieri.
By the way, people are making fun of you saying monkey.
I saw that. I was pissed. I'm saying it right. This is why I said, oh, it might be a Southern thing. And so I didn't put in the comments. I'm like, oh, it's probably a Southern thing.
When I rewatched it, I was like, I laughed to myself. Like, he said that funny.
How do you say it?
Monkey.
Monkey.
See, even there, it's like you're adding an extra like, oh.
It want people to know what I'm saying, man. You know, you got it for a long.
You're like monkey.
Monkey. I'm on that monkey.
It's okay. I can't say Mario correctly, apparently.
Some words, man, you know, you just got to be loose with your vocabulary.
All right, we're recording.
Hey, everybody. Today we're starting our 4th episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to be talking about anxiety, and I'm going to have Dr. Vincent Barbieri start us off. I'm Dr. Jacob Ambrose, by the way. Forgot to mention that. But yeah, start us off.
Well, I wanted to start off with my third favorite Zen story. It's, we'll call it the Zen story of the monk who was murdered.
Ooh, okay.
So
Heavy.
every Zen story I have is about a monk getting murdered in some way. But okay, so the story goes that there's a Zen master living in a monastery. And in his bedroom one night, a burglar appears and kills him. And as the monk is being killed, he screams out in fear. And this was heard by a student around the hallway. And the student, later learning that the monk died, is so distraught. His entire worldview of Zen is completely disrupted. How could this master experience so much fear? And so another Zen master overheard him, distraught, and said, there's nothing wrong with the way the monk responded to being killed. Zen is not about numbing yourself to emotions. It's about feeling things as they come up. When it's time to laugh, you laugh. When it's time to cry, you cry. And when it's time to be afraid, you be afraid. The problem is not the fear itself. And I think oftentimes when people think about anxiety, they often can't distinguish it from fear. But anxiety and fear are actually very different things. Fear is a naturally occurring emotion when you feel like you're in danger. Anxiety is experiencing resistance to potential fear in the future. Like the fear hasn't happened yet. You're anticipating fear. It's almost a fear of fear. And that's our experience of it. But anyway, I just thought that was a good story to set us off.
I love that. That's a good way to set us up because it's got both your definition of fear and then also what I'm noticing about Zen stories is that it's usually wanting to make something flow through. Like anger is not something to push, pull, or stop. It's something that exists. And the moment you start to challenge its existence. So it's the same with fear, sounds like. And so how do you connect that with anxiety? I mean, how would you differentiate fear from anxiety?
Well, fear is like if I like hold a gun up at you, if you didn't feel fear, that would be weird.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But if I, let's say someone robs you, right? And for the next 6 months, every time you walk outside, you have this anxiety that comes up associated with anticipating being robbed again.
Yeah.
That's not the same because there is no danger presenting itself to you in that moment. And being able to distinguish the difference is very important in working on your anxiety because you can identify what's real and what's not real.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's what I've been seeing a whole lot with clients on social media too. A lot of people who are dealing with anxiety, the first thing to figure out is, am I dealing with anxiety or fear? And so many people in the comments and all sorts of things are saying, you know, I don't have anyone to support me. Or I don't have anyone out there for me, and I have these threats that I can't handle. What do I do about it? And I always say the first step is to figure out, are you accurately interpreting the threats? Because if you're not, that means you're over-assuming how little support you have. So if you go to therapy, you can get that figured out. So a lot of people are like, well, that's invalidating or X, Y, and Z. But I think that's the first step to ask yourself, am I really, how am I interpreting reality? Because you can really get stuck in a box at some point.
And in the context of fear, it's like the real question is, am I actually in danger right now? And if you can't honestly say yes, then you're not experiencing fear, you're experiencing anxiety.
So say more about that.
Well, I have many definitions of anxiety. I'm going to list them all.
I'm about to lay you down some on you too.
I'm going to go through them as we talk about it, but one of my favorite definitions is by this guy named Krishnamurti, who I've talked about before, and he talks about fear as the result from a movement internally of certainty to uncertainty. So when we have this sense of certainty, which is how we normally live our lives, when that gets replaced for some external reason by a feeling of uncertainty, what normally comes of that is the feeling of anxiety. Like, oh, I was feeling like, let's say you find out that your partner is not, or maybe is talking to someone else, right? And your relationship security, all of a sudden gets replaced by relationship insecurity, and as a consequence, you feel anxiety. And so it's this movement from certainty to uncertainty, and our response to uncertainty. Anxiety is a response to uncertainty. It's not the best response, but it's kind of like the natural response.
Yeah. It's like if you feel like you're gambling your life away if you make a decision, and it's not, the stakes aren't that high. That looks like anxiety. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And I just like fear of fear. You're afraid of being afraid. You know, you're not afraid because there's nothing happening, but you're afraid you might be afraid in the future. You're almost trying to seek peace in the future rather than in the present. Every time you're anxious, your anxiety is you trying to solve some future problem in the present.
Yeah, I can see that. Whenever I do a cold plunge at my gym, the hardest part is not the cold plunge itself, but
it's the before.
It's everything before. And Tilbe, my wife, just kept, like last night, she was trying to push me to go into it. I was like mad because I was pissed because I told her before, I was like, if I don't do it with you make me.
That's so funny.
And I was so mad that I told my past self did that, so there was regret there. But then as I was waiting to get out, I was like, I really do believe the hardest part is thinking about it before. And I'm a psychologist, so I know it, but
doesn't change the reality.
It does not change it one bit. But you're right. You're so right about that.
A few days ago, Elizabeth was like, let's do a cold plunge. And immediately was like, no. And then we didn't do it.
No.
I was very confident in not wanting to do it. I'm like, I feel good right now. I don't want to be cold.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, man. If it's sunny outside, I might be able to do it. But if it's the evening time, I'm like, oh.
If I'm in any sense slightly cold, I'm not doing a cold plunge.
Yeah.
But I do know what you're saying. It's the right before. Once you're in it, that's the thing is it's not the unpleasantness of an experience that causes anxiety. It's the uncertainty of the unpleasantness. Like, I don't know how bad this is going to be.
Yeah.
By the second it is as bad as it's going to be, you're not anxious unless you're not sure when it's going to end. So the other part of anxiety, I think, especially with pain, because that's what you were talking about, is, okay, I'm experiencing a cold, I'm experiencing back problems, whatever it is. Yeah. The anxiety is, when will it be over? You know, I don't know when it's going to be over, and therefore I don't know how to handle the uncertainty of this pain. The pain itself is secondary to when is this going to stop? And I think a lot of people get stuck in this feeling of, okay, I can handle this right now, but I can't handle this for 6 days. I can handle it for 4 days, but I can't handle it for 5. It's just the uncertainty of when it will end that causes a lot of distress too.
It's something very subjective that changes nothing about the present moment, but it changes everything about how you feel.
Like I have a history of producing kidney stones, which means I've had a lot of acute pain in my life. And the worst part about it is not, okay, the second worst part about it is the pain. The first worst part about it is you have no idea when the pain's going to end, but it will end, and it will end very quickly. And all of a sudden you're fine. But it could be 2 hours, it could be 6 hours, it could be weeks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's very stressful.
But what are some of your definitions of anxiety?
So when I think about, I have a function of emotions that I think about. And so when I'm thinking about anxiety, I start with fear. So when I think about fear, I think about the emotion that gives you energy to identify obstacles. And I relate that to anger as the emotion that destroys obstacles. And so sadness then is grieving the loss of your ability to obtain whatever goal is important to you. So when you're thinking about fear, fear both intensifies depending on how many obstacles you're imagining, but then also how threatening those obstacles might be. And so obstacles, taking away a little bit from what you were talking about, can look like a time limit or a perception of pain, or it can look like a person blocking your way. And so that's why one of the things I pointed out is like anxiety is usually a lot of people are anxious because they're not angry enough, and a lot of people like that post, and a lot of people dislike that. But it's practically very true, because anxiety is all about imagining obstacles that you don't necessarily need to be imagining. And anger is the emotion that destroys obstacles. So logically, if you're destroying obstacles with anger, you're getting to a place to where your fear is reducing to a point that's more in line with the way reality ought to be. You're not dodging your boss and walking around to the back door because you're afraid they're going to ask you to stay late or anything like that. You're going straight through the front door and you're saying, I don't want to stay late today. And if you have a problem with that, then that's not okay. And I might need to find another place to work. So anger is a gamble. And for people with anxiety, it feels like too big of a gamble, not worth gambling on in order to reduce that anxiety and turning it to fear. So that's how I like to think about it. Fear and anxiety.
So it kind of propels you into approach, whereas anxiety does the opposite. It propels you into avoidance.
The opposite of anger and or
So anger propels you into approaching a problem, whereas anxiety by itself leads one to more avoidance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny because I was getting in an argument on Reddit about this a couple days ago with someone.
You argue with people online too?
Oh my God, I love arguing on Reddit.
Oh man. Okay, go ahead.
I'm not allowed to argue on most platforms.
Okay.
But the problem with looking at psychology as hard science is it's not a hard science, because the things we're discussing are kind of abstract concepts. Like the ego is not something you can locate on an MRI. And as a consequence, the way you measure and analyze psychological phenomenon is through indirect behavior. You know, behavior is the byproduct of whatever weird shit is going on inside of our brains. It's the only way to actually measure what a person is experiencing. And so if you are witnessing someone who has a pattern of avoidance, which is a behavior, no matter what it is, you can assume that underneath that is deep anxiety. And I'll take it to an extreme. Like, for instance, you watch on TV some documentary about people who are extremely picky about what food they eat, which in another way of saying that is they're super avoidant of most food. It's a guarantee that they experience significant amount of anxiety.
Yeah.
Because avoidance and anxiety are one is the abstract version of the behavior. And like you were saying, anger for a lot of people helps us act. It helps us move in a direction of approach. And that is a good counteraction towards anxiety, which naturally makes us avoid stuff.
Yeah.
You're afraid of birds. The first thing you're not going to do, you're going to avoid places where there might be birds.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You have to work against that in order to overcome it.
Yeah, physiologically, you have to allow yourself to regulate and get used to whatever response you're avoiding. And you can't do that the more you avoid something. I also like to think about and so I'll make statements like, oh, you know, if you're not angry enough, then you're anxious. But really, it's not one way. There's all sorts of different ways it can go. Like, I'll also say that if you're not allowing space for sadness, then you're likely going to be more anxious as well. Because sadness, I've seen it as an emotion of embracing your limitations. So if you don't embrace your limitations and you think you have to solve everything, then that creates a space where the people around you who care about you don't even get the opportunity to jump in and prove you wrong, that you are the only one that needs to take care of your problems. Because sadness is a low energy emotion that slows you down. And anger and fear are both high energy emotions that say, hey, there's an obstacle, I have to solve it. Obstacle, solve it. So what happens when you've trained yourself repeatedly to solve problems really, really quickly, and you look around and you see that you've thought 7 steps ahead about a problem that someone else could jump in and help, but you've robbed them of that opportunity to come and help you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you walk away with a very cold world where everybody is not really caring about the things you care about. And then you walk away thinking that nobody cares about me, when in reality, people just think you're a fast machine. They don't even get a chance to know what you're dealing with, you know?
I like what you're saying about sadness too, because it's like, I think true sadness at its core is an acceptance of reality.
Yes.
So like true sadness is an acceptance of reality. And therefore, when you accept all of the harshness of reality, you no longer are fighting it. And a lot of anxiety is a fighting of reality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I feel like anxiety at its core is resisting an imagined future. You know, you're bracing for a potential future discomfort. You know, none of it's actually happening. And so your ability to tolerate uncertainty is directly related to the amount of anxiety you have.
Yes.
The less you are able to tolerate uncertainty, the more you will be anxious.
Right. And I mean, that's so good because if let's say anxiety wins and you control every aspect of reality, then you stop existing.
Mm-hmm.
You lock the potential of spontaneity and novelty that are all the beautiful things of life in the box of preparedness, planning. And so if everything goes the way you plan for, then you really don't get to ever live at all. And you never get to be surprised at what life is actually all about, which is connecting with things that are very foreign to you and experiencing novelty.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like anxiety saying, well, if you don't control reality, then things could go a million ways that you don't plan for. And honestly, that's one of the best things that could happen. But anxiety tells you that it's bad when it's really a really possibly good thing.
Exactly. It's so funny because when you're talking, it's like if you are an anxious person, like you said, it kind of locks you out from experiencing novelty, right?
Yes.
But like, so our minds trick us into thinking, okay, I'm an anxious person. I'm going to avoid this, and this because that makes me anxious. And then I'll have peace, right? But the problem is once you cut out this, and this in your life, all of a sudden anxiety finds new things to cut out. It's a never ending cycle of avoidance. Your mind thinks, I'm going to hit this. I don't like people who are particularly angry. I don't like dogs who are particularly smelly, and I don't like chairs that are particularly green. So as long as I avoid those 3 things, I'm going to be at peace. But then you avoid those 3 things, and all of a sudden new things are added to it. It's never a process that is done and then you're at peace. It's always a process. It's kind of like I was saying a few podcasts ago, where you are afraid of your house being burglarized, so you put padlocks on the door. But then after a couple of weeks, that's just not satisfying enough, and then the fear comes back. So then you put an alarm system on, but then that's not enough. So then you buy a baseball bat, and it's just it just never ends because your anxiety, the more you feed it, the more hungry it gets. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well said. Yeah, the more you feed it, the more anxiety you get. Yeah, that's good.
And so the feeding it is avoiding stuff that, and there's nothing wrong with avoiding, like you go to a restaurant and it makes you sick, avoid that restaurant. But if something is not inherently dangerous, you are creating monsters out of teddy bears. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If something's not dangerous and you start avoiding it, all of a sudden your internal perception of danger is becoming distorted, and you can't trust it as much anymore. Mm-hmm. So every time you feel this sense of I'm in danger, it's not actually correlated to being in danger.
Yeah. You have to ask yourself, well, what does it mean if anxiety wins? Does that mean that you successfully hid under the covers to hide from the boogeyman in the closet?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you did, then that's actually just a misunderstanding of reality, and you rob yourself of the chance of opening the closet to see that the boogeyman is not real, and then you have full access to the rest of your bedroom. So if anxiety wins, then you sit at the corner of your bed, you cover yourself up, you make sure there's like 10 pillows blocking your closet, and you rearrange your life around your fears, which is the actual perpetrator, but you're doing all the work, only to find out that you've been running from something that's not there sometimes. And then, like you said, too, it's important to validate that there's a lot of people that are dealing with real fears, too. There's real fears, and that's our jobs as psychologists to help you figure out what are real fears and what are the things that you are robbing yourself of enjoying because you think there are things to avoid.
That was a very insightful, but I have to say this one statement.
Uh-huh.
Imagine like a therapist who's like a really bad therapist, and they have a book. It's called Rearranging Your Life to Avoid. Well, wait, what did you say?
Rearranging your reality for the sake of the perpetrator or something.
Or yeah, it's just like give into the fear. Rearrange your life to accommodate your anxiety.
Rearrange your life to make your anxiety happy.
It's like, hey, if something scares you, avoid it.
Yeah.
Chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
Just hide under the covers.
Yeah. Chapter 3, just curl into a fetal position.
I mean, I feel like this is a topic that we both resonate with because I don't know, I've experienced a lot of anxiety in my life, and I think the short-term relief of avoidance is actually very powerful. There's a lot of gravity to avoidance that makes you feel incredibly drawn to, like if you're, for instance, socially anxious, avoiding going out. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The relief of canceling plans at the last minute might be the most enjoyable experience one can have if you have social anxiety.
Yeah, 100%.
So there's a part of you that's kind of like, and this is what I also say to clients, like the words that your mind will tell you to get you to avoid are going to be very nuanced. Like let's say you have social anxiety, you're about to go to a party, but you don't want to go. Mm-hmm. Do you think your mind is stupid enough to go, hey, you've got social anxiety, don't go to this? No, your mind's going to be very creative with the way it helps you avoid. Like, you don't even like those people, or, you've had a long week, you're tired, maybe you need to rest. Like, it's going to entice you into avoidance. It's not going to be, it's not going to be an easy choice.
Yeah, I agree.
You're tempted.
Yeah, it's going to want to tempt you, and you're imagining, and the more tempting it is, the more obstacles it's throwing at you. Mm-hmm. And that's multiplying the fear. And then the fear starts to grow, and then you're more convinced afterwards of like, it's not worth it. Why would I be stupid enough to go out and just feel bad? And then next time it gets harder.
Next time it gets harder, and then it gets harder, and it gets harder. It's like this snowball effect of the more you avoid, the harder it is to overcome it. And like, you ever see The Truman Show? Have I talked to you about this?
Probably.
The Truman Show, it's like a movie. Okay, so The Truman Show is a movie starring Jim Carrey where he basically unknowingly is on a movie set for his entire life. It's like this large like dome that he thinks is like his island home. And he slowly, gradually realizes he's on a TV show that starring him. Everyone's actors, right?
And they're just watching him.
Yeah, that's the movie. But there's this scene when he's like 12 or like 8 or something, where he's like at the beach, crawling on this sand dune, kind of getting to the top of it. And right on the other side is the movie set. Like people are kind of sitting in director chairs and shit. And the parents / actors didn't realize that he was getting close to seeing all of this stuff. Yeah. And they're like, oh, no, don't go over there. And so then he turns around and doesn't see it. But I often feel like anxiety is often like that, where sometimes we get really close to revealing the unreality of our anxious thoughts. But then our mind is like, oh, no, and then pulls us right at the last second. And we don't get to notice like, oh, wait, not everyone is criticizing me in their heads all the time, or I'm not going to die if I take a flight. Whatever it is, our minds at the last second grab us back right before we can see the bullshit that it's hiding.
And I think that's true, because anxiety and fear is an emotion that grabs you and pulls you back into identification mode. Mm-hmm. If anxiety is something that pulls you into identification mode, then it paralyzes you, because that's really helpful if you're trying to analyze something that you're trying to solve. So if you're being pulled back into identification mode when you're trying to complete something that's really important, you're going to notice that, and this is not all the time, but I think this is why people shake in anxiety, because I think their body is really stopping and going. And I think that's the force that you're talking about, that it yanks you back before you ever get a chance to just dive into reality with anger. So if you never deal with your anxiety, it really screws up your performance when you're trying to just be effective because you keep going into identification mode. And identification mode is a good thing, but it keeps you from continuing to allow anger to take the lead and allow you to complete a task really well. At least that's how I see it.
So what's an example of identification mode?
So an example, a really, really good analogy could be, let's say you're driving a tractor, right? And you're looking to see which boxes you need to move. I'm horrible with construction. I don't know anything about construction, so just go with the analogy. Let's say you're driving a tractor and there's a bunch of boxes you need to move. Anxiety, no, not anxiety. Fear is the emotion that will say, what do I need to have done here? What's blocking me from my goal? And then anger is the button that says go, and you'd start doing it. Problematic anger might look like you're hitting the go button and you're not even thinking, you're recklessly destroying the boxes and you're getting in the way of all other employees at the job. But unhealthy fear looks like you've calculated 1,000,000 times the ways it could go wrong. You've calculated 1,000,000 times all the boxes that need to be moved, and you haven't hit the go switch. And in fact, every time you hit the go switch, you stop immediately like, wait, did I think about this? And everybody's looking at you and thinking, wait a minute, is this person a good construction worker? And in your mind, you're starting to wonder the same thing because you're like, why can't I perform? And the reason you can't perform is because you keep judging your performance and you keep judging how good you can do because you keep going into identification mode.
It sounds like identification mode is kind of like you have an idea in your head about how it's supposed to look. Like, for instance, let's say you have performance anxiety, like sexual performance anxiety. You have an idea in your head about how this is supposed to go. And when maybe you're distracted for a minute or anxious or whatever, now you're not fitting that idea in your head, and all of a sudden you're out of it. You know, like it erodes your sense of being present because I'm not matching the expectation I had about what this is supposed to look like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense.
And I feel like that's the thing with anxiety. It pulls you out of the present. You can't both be present and anxious. You could be present and fearful, but you can't be present and anxious because anxiety is inherently a withdrawal from reality.
Yeah. That's why I always say, like, one of the ways to work on your social anxiety is to stop thinking about yourself. Stop being so selfish.
Yeah.
Because anxiety is one of the most, I would say, I don't have, empirically based evidence to say this, but it's my opinion that fear is the most selfish emotion out of fear, anger, and sadness.
Mm-hmm.
Because fear is all about self-preservation. You're drowning and you're trying to get above the water, and you don't care if there's other people around you. You're willing to just drop them down to the ground so you can get to the top. So if you're constantly in a state of anxiety, you might find that people around you find you to be very selfish, or you suppress that because you hate that about yourself, and you go into the world in a very, very suppressed way because you don't like the side of yourself that you realize is very selfish. And so if you're dealing with selfishness and anxiety, you have a really hard time just being around people for very long periods of time. You might even want to isolate.
When you first said that, I was skeptical, and then 12 seconds later, I'm like, oh, I totally agree now. No, but like it makes me think of the most selfish like this people that are most often associated with selfishness in the clinical psychology world are people of narcissistic personalities because they're completely fear-driven. I mean, at their level of experience, it's not fear-driven, but anyone that's observing them can recognize that every behavior that you witness from someone who's narcissistic tends to be out of self-preservation because they're incredibly fearful of being found out and recognized for the lack of maybe a concrete identity that they have, the shame that's behind all of it. And so fear is driving their behavior of self-preservation, and as a consequence, the people around them experience a lot of selfishness. But at its core, what's driving their behavior is fear.
Yeah, object or obstacle it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you never even get to spend much time with the people around you in a very, connected kind of way because you're so concerned about.
And to go the spiritual side of it.
Here we go again.
Well, I was telling you about that A Course in Miracles, that book that I'm reading.
Uh-huh.
But fear is inherently the thing that causes us to feel separation between each other. The disconnect is always caused by some fearful experience. And you can't truly connect with anyone if there is fear between you.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine going to a playground and you're constantly thinking about all the ways you could fall off the monkey bars or that you monkey.
I wasn't gonna say anything.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, just imagine all the ways that you could fail. If you're at a playground and you think about all the ways that things go wrong, you're no longer playing with all your peers and the people around you. You're not connecting with them.
You're not connecting with them, and also when you're constantly fearful, you're not connecting with yourself. Being in a state of fear means you're constantly feeling this barrier between others, but also yourself, because yourself is being pushed down for the sake of self-preservation. Like your desire, who you are, I think, is more closely aligned with what you aspire to. So if you aspire to love or you aspire to be the greatest blank in the world, the second fear comes in is the second you disconnect yourself with those aspirations.
And that's why I think that anger is such a helpful emotion when you're trying to become what you want to be, who you aspire to be, because anxiety and fear keeps you from ever existing, period, because you're in that self-preservation mode. You're not thinking about, like, you think it's a gamble to be who you are. And so you stay locked in yourself. And so I always say that anxiety, when it's at its worst, it turns your life into a game of whack-a-mole. And you're supposed to be enjoying yourself on this date, but you can't even focus on what's going on around you because you're constantly trying to destroy obstacles with your whole life. Focusing on getting like a high score on this game and missing the point that, hey, there's a date right here that feels neglected the whole time.
It's so true. I mean, one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had was so I had a kidney stone. I was in the hospital for like 5 hours. It was the worst one yet. Now, keyword yet, because I had worse ones after that. But it was the worst one yet.
Yeah.
And it finally was over. And so I felt it was finally over. And then all of a sudden, I felt this euphoria because I was no longer in pain. It's so nice to not be in pain when you've been in an intense amount of pain. But after like 30 minutes, I started thinking about something that was worrying me, that was unrelated. And I'm like, it took 30 fucking minutes for me to go back into my normal. It's always something else with anxiety. There's always another thing. And that is why it is so strong, because anxiety tricks us into thinking, if you can deal with this thing, you're going to be okay. But the reality is, the second you deal with this thing, another thing is going to come after it. And so most people, once they realize that, get very discouraged and feel like it's all futile. But the reality is it's only futile if you keep approaching it like that. You have to find a different door to walk through that doesn't involve fixing the thing that's causing you distress, because that's an endless cycle. And then most clients, when I say that, they're like, then what the fuck is the other door? And it's like, well, it depends on the person. It depends on how you navigate uncertainty, because the opposite direction is the solution. So if you navigate uncertainty by impulsively spending or you have to replace a coping mechanism with a better one. And ultimately, I think it leads to like acceptance. Like, if uncertainty is what causes anxiety, if trying to escape uncertainty is what causes anxiety, then making a point of finding comfort with uncertainty. How do I find comfort with uncertainty? That's the real question if you want to work on your anxiety.
Yeah. So the way to fix anxiety is not to plan more ahead and get better at that, or to navigate solve your problems. Yeah.
Look at like, okay, a perfect example of someone who's like, hey, I'm going to fix anxiety by planning more ahead and making sure every T is crossed and I is dotted. Monica from Friends, right? She's like, she's got this OCPD representation, which is like a very niche disorder, but she's vacuuming her vacuum. That's that kind of energy. That kind of person has found relief in planning everything and making sure everything is spotless and making sure every part of a trip is accounted for and the itinerary of every destination is laminated, right? But it just begets more planning and it never actually solves the problem, and it creates a new anxiety of I will only feel at peace if 15,000 things are done beforehand. So it's you're trying to solve something, but then you create just another problem in the process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, that goes to if you're trying to get rid of your anxiety by performing better, like if you're performing at like 100% and you're like, I don't know if they're going to accept me at this performance, and then you perform at 120% the next day, and then you get accepted, and then you perform at 140%, and then you're up to performing at 300% of your normal ability, then you get to that point where you're convinced in your heart that, well, I have evidence that I'm accepted at 300%. So what happens when you never get evidence that you're accepted at 99 or 98 or 85? Well, then you rob yourself of ever learning that you could be embraced whenever you're at 85%. So like you said, the more you plan ahead and the more that you succeed at satisfying your anxiety, that reptile inside of you that learns based on past experiences will have zero experiences of being accepted when you're at your best, which is when I think you're at 0% because you're existing at that point.
Look at like kids who have parents who are super pushy about learning the violin or learning a sport or something. The kid's brain is so malleable, and the feedback when they do well is so powerful. It's such a dopamine hit that they start to become addicted to doing well simply for the sake of it makes them feel good about themselves. What they don't realize, because they're children, is the flip side of that, which is when I don't do well, I feel awful. And so now they're both seeking doing well to reinforce this feeling that they've been chasing, which diminishes over time, but they're also running away from the pain that comes with being inadequate or feeling inadequate. I mean, it's just such a bad game to start playing. But once you get caught in it, you don't see another option of like, well, how do I feel good about myself then?
And then people expect you to perform at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment you stop, they're like, Vinny, what the hell is wrong with you?
Well, that's the expectations, I think, get in the way of people changing. I think a lot of times, like if someone's like, oh, I have no boundaries at work and they ask me to do 1,000 things, and everything you're saying about changing expectations and setting more boundaries is good, but then people are going to be like, but where's old Jeff who used to answer every call I had? It's like, give it 2 weeks, they'll adjust.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you here's an experiment: find a friend, and if you text them every 2 days, text them once every 5 days for the next month, and I guarantee you, after a month passed, they will have completely forgotten about your old pattern.
Yeah, that's how you beat anxiety. You have to fail at what you're trying to succeed at and make it so that the stakes aren't so high. But to beat anxiety, you have to fail and allow the obstacles that you are afraid of to happen to you so that you can make it past that initial phase so that you can get to the place where you realize like, well, it's okay. Because when you first start trying to beat anxiety, like you're saying, things are going to get a little bit worse before they get better. So if you allow those things to go bad, then you're allowing reality to realign, which is going to hurt. It's going to hurt you, and all the things you're afraid of are going to come true. But take heart. Those things are going to slowly fade away once people realize, like, hey, you're not the pushover that we thought you were, or you're not the one that has to solve all of our problems all the time. And I see this a lot of times in relationships where people will complain about their partner and they're saying that, well, they just expect me to do so much. And I'll go back to reference you, but like you're holding the shovel at some point because people get used to you doing a certain thing. And so an analogy I'll use is, imagine you have a vending machine that works perfectly all the time. So when people push the button, they get a soda can. What happens when that vending machine stops working for one day? People go up to that vending machine, they're shaking it over and over again, like, give me what you're supposed to give me a soda. But what happens when you see a vending machine that's like been not operable for the past like year? nobody's going to touch that thing because they're like, I'm assuming. So in your relationships, it's important to know when to be a vending machine, but also to know when to not be a vending machine. The one that people know, if I shake them a little bit, they're going to give me what I want.
And there is going back to fear, like there's a fear behind changing expectations. And that is, if I change the expectations, what if they don't want to stick around anymore? Ooh. Maybe my value in this relationship is based off of what I was providing. And I don't think people realize that, but a lot of times when we're talking about setting boundaries, the deeper fear is, well, I don't know what this relationship will be once I stop providing this thing that I don't want to provide anymore. So there's a lot of fear of abandonment in that too.
So spot on.
Yeah, well, I'm very good.
You're just a very handsome, smart man.
The amount of times I tell clients that I'm very good at my job, I'm surprised they keep coming back.
I'm not that bold yet. I don't say it.
Oh,
I'm starting to get there though.
I like trash talk to them. I'm like, I just destroyed this.
Yeah, like you don't realize how good this is.
You just made your money's worth. You know what? I'm going to charge you 2 copays for this one.
No, he's not really doing that, people.
No, I don't do that yet.
Oh my gosh. Not yet.
And if I'm having an off day, I'm like, you know what? Here's a 20. Sorry. Sorry about that.
No, man, you're not that guy. You're a good guy.
I think that anxiety is my favorite thing to talk about.
Me too.
Simply because I've dealt with it for such a long period of time, and I have managed to make significant strides with it. But I do think the biggest agent of change for working on your anxiety is working on your perception to handle hard, difficult things in the future. Like if your perception of yourself is, if this bad thing happens, I don't know how I'm going to handle it, then you're going to have more anxiety than someone who says, if this bad thing happens, I'll figure it out. I don't know how I'm going to figure it out because it hasn't happened yet. I don't even know what the problem is, but I trust enough in myself to navigate this thing effectively, and then they probably can refer to past experiences. Like, for instance, you and I have both recently started private practices, right? And the thing that I'm not saying I don't experience anxiety about it, but the thing one might feel is, holy shit, this is this new venture that has all of these different moving parts. It's very challenging, but I have enough experiences in my life, like for instance, when I did my dissertation experiment, to know that I can handle a lot of moving parts at once. Like I've been through enough gauntlets to know things in this category at the very least I can handle. Maybe in other categories in my life I have less self-efficacy, but in certain categories I feel confident enough that it's not going to create too much anxiety in me.
Yeah, and this is part of the reason why I tell a lot of clients, CEOs or bosses love anxious people. Like people in charge love anxious people because when they find someone who's anxious, they're like, all right, well, they might not know it consciously, but they feel at ease because they know this person's not willing to gamble to get what they want. They're not willing to deal with me telling them to stay late. This person who has anxiety is not comfortable with setting a strong boundary and saying, my worth is not based on, suffering so much for my boss. And so if you have someone who's very anxious that's working for you, you start to get that sense of ease because you know that they will give anything so that they can impress their boss and feel safe and stick around. Versus if you're someone who's more confident, your boss might start to like you less.
Mm-hmm. I've experienced that. I've experienced that a lot.
So anxious people, whenever they're working on their performance at work, they're like, well, I want to be more confident, but my boss might like me less. And I'm like, well, that's exactly the currency you need to pay to be less anxious. Because the moment you start to get more confident, your boss, if they're not a good one, is going to start liking you less because they love anxious people. And when I say that, man, people start to realize like, hey, I've been working for the wrong thing. But
that's a new thought that you've never said to me and that I've never thought of, but totally makes sense.
That's
awesome. Like that really that really resonated with me. I think that certain people in positions of power prey upon anxious people because they know they're more easily manipulated.
Exactly. And then whenever you're trying to like go somewhere and do something entrepreneurial, if you have anxiety, you don't ever learn that it's not that much of a risk to go out and try something new, But that's why people who are bosses all the time and stuff, they're so good and fluent in anger, and they're like, well, I've got a lot of evidence that I can just do my own thing. But
Yeah, and I feel like that ties in exactly what I was saying. Like, if you can find a way to be more okay with what happens, whatever that may be, you're gonna feel less anxious. Because let's say I express my needs to my employer and it's met with resistance. I am going to be more okay with whatever happens, and therefore I'm not going to be as anxious about how this goes. But the second you become less okay with what happens, which is just another way of saying, I can't handle the uncertainty of this outcome, all of a sudden you start mentally preparing. Maybe you rehearse the conversation in your head a bunch of times, or you anticipate all the different ways it can go wrong. And meanwhile, you're in the shower all while this is happening. You know what I mean? Like, that's the disconnect you have from reality that anxious people are really trying to work on, but don't realize to work on it is to go through a door they've never gone through, which is, I don't know what's going to happen, and I can't completely prepare for everything.
to deal with anxiety, realize that the stakes are lower than they actually feel to be. Jump through the door.
Yeah, I mean, like, assessing your sense of control. Like, I have control here, here, and here, but I don't have control here, here, and here. It's really hard to do when when you have this sense of, I don't know if I can handle if it goes this way.
And this is, I'm getting too excited. I'm like, and this is really, really interesting when you work with someone anxious. It's fascinating the feedback that I'll give to two separate people. Like someone who is really, really sad and depressed, they're like, well, if I take control, what if I screw everything up? My whole life has been dictated in some ways by other people, and they've always stepped in and saved the day. So I haven't gotten any evidence that I can take care of things. And I'll say, well, the risk of failing is the same if you were to take action, because other people can fail too. And so with anxiety, it's the opposite, but it's the same thing. People with anxiety say, well, if I try to take a leap and gamble and really do the thing that I'm afraid of, then it's very possible that I'll fail. Or no, flip that. If someone with anxiety is feeling like, well, if I jump through this door and take a risk and trust someone else, then that person might fail me. And so they say, how can I learn to trust them? Well, I was like, well, the gamble sometimes is just as high as if you trust yourself so much to control the situation. So with anxiety, it's challenging the belief that things are most effective when you're in charge, and accepting the reality that sometimes they are good when you're in charge, and they're also effective when other people are in charge. So don't rob yourself of one of the most incredible things that you could utilize, which is the people around you and their ability to support you in your time of need.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it goes back to like this perception of what role do I play in the outcome, and what role do other people play in the outcome, and where does the outcome become not in my control? Like, you can learn everything you can ever learn about making a garden and study it for 2 years before you ever plant a seed. And you also don't have complete control if the thing sprouts. And putting all of your sense of self in the outcome is always going to make you more anxious in the process. Like, for instance, like athletes, right? Athletes are known to be more superstitious than the average person, but it's because there's a lot of stakes in the outcome, and deep down they know that the only control they have is in the process. What I put in, how I train, what I eat, the way I work out, right? Like, at the end of the day, LeBron James loses games, and he is the best basketball player in the world, or at least was. And Jalen Brunson currently is. As a Knicks fan, I have to say that. But
Kobe Bryant all the time.
oh, he's not even in my top 3. But
What? Oh my gosh, continue.
But it's deep down, all of these people know that how things go is not completely in their control. And that's a very hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
It's a very hard pill to swallow.
And this is taught biblically in Christianity as well, because that's why, I mean, psychologically, it makes sense for Christians to tithe, to fast, and it makes sense for Christians to really embrace their weaknesses, and because there's even a scripture in Corinthians that talks about when I am weak, Christ is made strong in me. And so one of the reasons that makes sense to me psychologically is because you never get evidence that you're actually supported until you learn to let go and realize your limitations. So every time that you tithe with your time or your money, you're recreating the belief that the only reason I'm able to stay alive and be secure is if I have enough money or time. And the only reason that I'm able to have good relationships is when I'm not hangry because I haven't eaten all day. Because fasting recreates the environment where you're at your worst, you're engaging in relationships, and you're allowing yourself to exist at your worst with other people. And you continually come back to, well, it's not my actions or what I do that maintains relationships and my relationship with God, but God himself. So all of those actions psychologically make sense as well.
In Eastern philosophy, it's considered asceticism, but it's the same concept of like, if I stop seeking these hedonic pleasures, can I still find access to this thing? And I think at the end of the day, it's really about, can I recognize that my source of true power does not come from how things go? Yeah. There's something that's prior to that. There's something that I bring into each situation that I bring into each situation, and once each situation is over, is still there, whether I win or lose or however I look at it. And that's the thing that should be the source of your comfort. And the second we start making the source of our comfort, like getting rid of anxiety or seeking pleasure, we get caught in this spiral that is very seductive, but also always leads back to the to nothing.
Yeah.
It's always hollow at the end of it. And it's, the meek shall inherit the earth. Like there's an element of the things you think you should be, which is this powerful, rich, whatever, is everything that gets you further away from true peace.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what you said during one episode too, which was very profound, I thought, because I had really dug into that scripture a lot later. But, it's tougher for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they're not talking about a literal needle. They're talking about, in the olden days, they would have a camel that would carry all of their supplies that would need to bow down and let go of all of its supplies in order to enter through this giant door underneath this smaller door that was considered the eye of the needle. And so in order for the camel to enter, it had to let go of every single attachment it had when it came to the world. So to enter into heaven, you have to realize that you can't take anything with you, and you have to let everything flow through you freely. That the glue that maintains your security is not your anxiety, is not your performance, and it's not how powerful you are, it's God. And it also gives you space to see that people actually think you're a pretty cool guy even when you don't have money. But how are you ever going to learn that if you don't allow yourself to drop everything at the door at the eye of the needle?
Anxiety protects you from the part of you don't need to take with you.
Ooh.
Yeah. And there's a Zen phrase that is the similar parallel to the eye of the needle one, which is, if you want to stop being dragged by life, then let go.
Yeah.
That's a good one, right?
I think so. Yeah. I'm just, sometimes you say something really, really good. And I'm just like, he might continue to keep going. So let me not express how much I like
I've got nothing left. But it's like we're holding on to stuff that we don't need to hold on to. And then we're looking at the thing we're holding on to and going, this is so unpleasant. It's let go of it.
Right.
Letting go of it is an uncertainty. This is what keeps us stuck is the things that will make us happy, the going over the sand dune to the other side, the thing that will reveal the truth of reality, is also an uncertain door we haven't walked through, and that's what scares us from walking through it. So we're constantly caught between what's familiar and what's uncertain.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of psychology is wrapped up in this. I think about it like this, but all the way from childhood, you have a pain avoidance instinct and you have a pleasure instinct. You know, Freud talked about like sexual instincts and all that. But if you really simplify it, it's you have
Down
a
to like our
pleasure.
amoeba organism.
Yeah.
Like approach, avoid.
Approach, avoid, like you were saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
approach, avoid. And so then you set up the rest of your experiences by approaching and avoiding based on your experiences, which you found to lead to pleasure and what you found to lead to pain. And that's so different for every person. Like someone who's been overlooked in childhood, they're going to really seek being seen. And someone who's not had food growing up is going to be like, well, if you have things, that makes you happy. And so your reptile is keeping track very early. And then later on, you go on to learn how to use emotions. And fear is one of the emotions that helps you maintain security or whatever it is that pleasure instinct is looking for, or avoiding pain.
The problem with that though is we have memory. You know, like the problem with approach avoidance single cell organism lifestyle, which worked for us when we were single celled organisms, is now we have memory, and our memory is organized kind of like in a library based on what the feel of that memory is. So all of the memories that have an anger feel are kind of in one area. All of the memories that have a happiness feel are over here. They're
Yep.
kind of organized by what they feel like. And so every time we experience something unpleasant, like for instance, let's say you get robbed, every time you're walking down a street that triggers any semblance of being robbed, maybe it's just this looking at a sidewalk, it's going to take you out of the present moment and bring you into the past. And as a consequence, so it takes you out of the present moment, brings you into the past, and now you're looking at the present through the prism of the past. And out of fear of it happening again, we start anticipating the future. Everything is about moving away from the present. We try to protect ourselves by moving away from the present, when in reality, the best way to protect yourself is staying in the present.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I agree.
It's really frustrating though, because our minds I think our minds completely exist by not being present.
Mm-hmm.
The second you're completely present is the second your mind stops existing. And the second you start thinking about what might happen or what has happened is the second your mind becomes reinforced and it becomes more solid.
Self-consciousness can take you there, and you want to avoid. And self-consciousness has been so helpful, but it's been really problematic for us.
Well, it's like it should be a halfway point for our human evolution. You know, it's like we're smart enough to develop a sense of self, but now we don't know what to do with it. It's like, it's here. I'm aware that I exist. Like Descartes, like I think, therefore I am. I think, I don't think I think, therefore I am. I think I am, therefore I am. I think the thinking part has gotten in the way of the being part.
I think so too. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense based on what we talked about last time with wanting to go from Eden all the way to like, oh, hey, I'm a human being and I have these ideas and reflections and whatnot. But I mean, this is completely like off topic.
Really quick off topic. I was watching a cooking show and they were talking about quince, which is like a fruit or something. And apparently that is what the actual apple was in the Garden of Eden. It was a quince.
Really?
So, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. No, I would never have guessed that. I was just apple.
Right? Like, they didn't have apples back then. They had quinces.
That's weird. What is that?
They're like, I'd like one Red Delicious.
The thing I want to think about is how are we doing on time, by the way? Just to check. It's kind of hard to keep track when you're in the zone.
Yeah.
Like 45 minutes or something?
Yeah, it's 4:12. You guys have been recording for 58 minutes now.
Whoa, man, it's going
Nice.
by slow.
It's
In a
going
good
slow?
way. I feel like it's going by fast, but it
Oh,
also
I
feels
see.
like we
Your
covered so
perception
much.
of time. Yeah.
Like, because my time blindness, almost made me fail the EPPP.
That's
well,
crazy.
it did make me fail it the first time.
I mean, honestly, you said that to me, and then the next thing that I did was like, I was like, I am not going to run out of time, and then I finished with like an hour left.
Oh my gosh. No, we're different.
And then I
think.
went over every question again and changed 30% of them. And
Oh
I'm
my
like, oh, I'm
gosh.
not passing. There's no way you pass when you change a third of your exam questions.
That is intense. But yeah, that's crazy. I hate the EPPP.
Oh my God. I was talking about the other day. It sucks.
But something else I wanted to bring up was we go into this direction usually of anxiety when it comes to having too much fear, basically, or imagining obstacles that you don't necessarily need to. But I think it's also fascinating to think about what happens when you go too far in the other direction of complacency. And so what I think about, and I've worked with a lot of people like this, but you get to a point where your fear is so low that you either become an inconvenience to the people around you, or you don't have anything worth fighting for. So when your fear is so low that you're not identifying obstacles, basically what's happening is you're no longer experiencing life in a way where there's anything worth fighting for.
So you've resigned yourself from doing anything about anything.
Yeah, exactly. And it can feel it can be conscious, it can be unconscious. But for example, like this is totally like a me thing too. Like I grew up in a situation where I've had so much stuff just work out for me. And so fear has been something in a lot of areas outside of like social anxiety and stuff like that, where I've just been like, I'm fine. And so I go around the world and I'm like, well, I don't. So the thing is that I feel I've wore like lack of anxiety, like a badge of like I'm perfectly fine.
You're like Forrest Gumping your way through life.
Yeah,
like I found an Apple company and now I have $1 billion.
and so exactly. So the thing is that when people so if you walk around with not enough fear, then it makes the people around you stressed and anxious oftentimes. And the reason for that is because you're not looking at all the obstacles that could hurt you because you don't think yourself is worth protecting in some ways, or it's unconscious. And then the people around you who care about you say, well, hey, Jacob is not looking out for himself, so I better look out for him, and I feel compelled to do so. And so we are both recreating the belief of the things we're already believing. So the person who's more anxious, who sees me not protecting myself, now they have to carry the weight of protecting me, and then they're further believing that, well, nobody else is coming to my rescue. Mm-hmm. And then for me, they're taking care of everything, and I'm in a position where I'm feeling like, well, everything just works out, you know?
Well, it's a sense of responsibility, and responsibility in any relationship is zero sum. So, for instance, if you're married to someone and they have expressed anxiety about finances, and you kind of have this, well, it will work out, it always works out mentality, then they're going to feel much more responsible for making sure that it works out because you've kind of given the responsibility to them. But as an experiment, if you did take on that responsibility, or at least some of it, and said, you know what, I'm a little anxious too, actually. Like I'm worried about if this is going to work out. All of a sudden, their shoulders come down a few inches, you know, because it's zero sum. And if I express that I'm going to be watching our bank account, all of a sudden you feel a little less responsible to watch it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's part of the reason why people in relationships are just constantly playing chicken with each other in that area. Because if you're, I kind of stole that from you because you always use that playing chicken, but that's exactly it. It's unfortunate, but the person who doesn't have anxiety is really, really good at playing chicken with people who do.
Mm-hmm. It's like how dirty can I be until you pick up my shit?
Yeah, yeah. And it's like an unconscious thing sometimes, but sometimes it's conscious. But I've seen that in myself sometimes where I lack so much anxiety where I'm just like, these things aren't worth taking care of. And then somebody else will take care of it. And I'm just like, you didn't have to do that. Mm-hmm. But in reality, you know, it's also coming from a place of a lack of passion and excitement, I think, about life. Because if you don't have enough fear, then it's very likely that you could be depressed. Because if you don't have enough fear, that means you don't have much worth fighting for. And so if you don't have much worth fighting for, then you're living life that's not really full. So if you're like dealing with fear, or you're not dealing with fear, and you have people around you that are taking care of you and coming to your rescue, then not only are you inconveniencing them, but you're not living life to the fullest, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like the difference between someone who's more prone to anxiety and someone who's more prone to depression, that fork in the road is mostly determined by the way you perceive the world. So if you have a sense of control that is beyond appropriate, if you think I'm way more in control over the outcomes of things than I actually am, you're probably going to err on the side of anxious. But if you are completely resigned to thinking, I can't control the outcome of anything, and nothing really is within my control, then you're probably going to go towards depression as your way of coping. So I feel like a lot of people, especially people who are depressed, it's like their appraisal of what's within their control is inappropriately low, whereas the appraisal of what's within my control when you tend to be anxious is inappropriately high.
Yeah, and that's why I always say, here's how you fix apathy and depression when it's related to that. You know, if you're like, I'll literally be in session. I'm like, hey, we're sitting down, and they're just saying, I just can't get motivated to do things. And, you know, my girlfriend is mad at me because she thinks I don't have any passion or motivation. And I'm like, yeah, she's right. And so what I'll do is I'll say, hey, well, let's do an exercise right now. Like, what do you notice right now that you don't like about your current circumstances? Do you notice that your back's a little tight because of your chair? Could you get a different chair? Is the lighting okay? You know, are you... And they might be like, well, you know, I don't really care about that stuff. It's fine. It's good enough. And I'm like, well, hey, for now, it doesn't matter. Right now, we're working on a new muscle. Change reality in a way that could benefit you so that your reptile, the part of yourself that learns based on experiences, gets a new comfort. And that's going to teach your brain to slowly start noticing obstacles. And then when the stakes are higher, when somebody you care about is at risk, you're going to be ready to start imagining obstacles that could affect them because you've practiced imagining obstacles that could affect you, even if there's some reason you don't feel like you're worth protecting.
There's in EPPP, I remember studying for this, there's this concept called instrumentality, but it's this perception of if I put in X amount of work, I will be given Y amount of return. And it really generally applies to, like, does your job have instrumentality? Do you feel like if you put X amount of effort in, that it's going to be rewarded with salary or praise or something? You know, like, is it going to move the needle of your life? And people who are depressed have a low sense of instrumentality. It's like, yeah, I can change the lighting, I can fix the chair, but I don't think it's going to yield me anything of value. And that's more... They think that that's the truth, when in reality, that's a protective belief they have to keep them from moving. So it's the lies that we tell ourselves so that we can stay stuck. Because, you know, I think a lot of times what keeps people from being motivated is like, oh, well, you know, is it really going to be worth it? It's like, how are you supposed to know in the abstract? You actually have to start doing things and seeing what happens. Motivation is kind of something that you have to create. It's not something that happens to you.
Yeah.
You don't get struck with motivation. You create it by feeling like I do X and I yield Y. Like, here's a good example. Your motivation to post has significantly increased in the last couple of months.
Oh, yeah.
My motivation to post has significantly dropped in the last couple of months because every time I post something, it's like 300 views.
Yeah.
And every time you post something, it's like 6 million views. But that's the thing. I'm not fighting that. It's just, I have the same psychology that everyone else has. So of course it's going to affect my motivation. And it is what it is. Like, maybe I can respond to it differently, but the first experience of it is the first experience of it. Same with anxiety. Like, if you were robbed, then you might feel this resistance to being outside, but that's not necessarily a problem to solve. I think a lot of times the reason I look at anxiety as the way we solve the problem of uncertainty. We solve uncertainty with anxiety, and it has some efficacy. Like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen. Let me ruminate and think about X, Y, and Z. And that is your experience of anxiety. It doesn't really do anything. It's kind of like a dog chewing a bone. It's like you think you're working, you think you're getting somewhere, but you end up in the exact same position on the floor no matter what. But you think you're solving something. And part of the letting go is realizing you're not solving anything. You think you're preparing for a conversation? There's an inflection point of preparing for an interview and just completely not being able to tolerate the uncertainty that comes with an interview. Someone once asked me on an interview, what's your spirit animal? And it kind of pissed me off. So I just said, Christopher Walken. And I ended up getting that job and taking that job.
There you go. See, and that's such a good experience because a lot of people don't get that. Of like, oh, I just let it loose, whatever I wanted, and that's good.
But you have to be okay with
Yeah.
the uncertainty of it.
I need some of that.
You do?
Yeah, I think so.
Let me give you a therapy session. In front of people.
Another thing that's slightly related. I tell my clients this a lot, but you have to stop doing the self-deprecating jokes because that's increasing your anxiety too. Like if you keep on making self-deprecating jokes, then you're like fixing your attention on everything that is inadequate inside of yourself. You're trying to make people feel disarmed by you, which is kind of a good thing. I like self-deprecating jokes in that way. Like it's funny sometimes, but if you're making self-deprecating jokes excessively, then how are you ever going to take yourself seriously?
Mm-hmm.
Because over time, not only are you imagining self-deprecating things about yourself that make yourself seem inadequate, but once you become fluent in self-deprecating, then now that's just playing in your mind when you go into spaces. So how are you ever going to walk onto like the stage of life and then feel confident if you're always thinking about, well, how can I make myself the butt end of this joke? And I mean, that kind of just, and some people will say like, well, it makes people like me more if I make self-deprecating jokes. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Like, who are you surrounding yourself with? Because it kind of begs the question, like, if somebody was making fun of one of my buddies, and it'd be funny, but after a while, if I saw you just putting yourself down repeatedly, I would say, well, you have inherent worth, and I think that I don't agree with the jokes you're making about yourself.
Self-deprecating is very self-preserving, or at least that's the lie we tell ourselves.
Interesting. Say more.
Like you self-deprecate. It's almost like you can't hit me, I'll hit me. Like just in case someone else is gonna come at me, I'm gonna come at me first. That's kind of why how comedians are born. Like I'm gonna come at me first, and now there's nothing left for you to hit. It's kind of like, you ever see How I Met Your Mother? Have you seen that show? You haven't seen shit.
I've seen some of it. Yeah.
Okay,
One of my buddies was like, "You need to watch this," and I watched a few clips from it.
So in How I Met Your Mother, there is a plot line about this thing called the slap bet. And essentially, like Barney bets Marshall something about, if you lose, I get to slap you 5 times and you won't know when it's coming, and you have an unlimited amount of time to do the slaps, right? And Barney loses, and Marshall basically toys with him. He like picks his hand up and then puts it back down. And over the course of weeks of anticipating the slap, Barney makes himself so miserable that he's begging for it, because the uncertainty of when the pain's gonna come becomes so intolerable that he begs for the pain just to remove the uncertainty. That's how much anxiety has a stranglehold on us. We will eventually become begging to be slapped in order to avoid the possibility of being slapped.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Wow. You'd rather deal with negative consequences than give up control.
Well, it's because our mind is anticipating what it would feel like, and that anticipation it's not that it's better or worse. It's just a completely different thing than the actual experience. The actual experience of pain versus our anticipation of pain are two completely different things. It's the difference between me asking you to pick up and drink your water, think about picking up and drinking your water, versus the experience of drinking water. One of them is living completely in your head, and if you never do it, you will end up dying of thirst. The other is an experience that is not quantifiable here. You know what I mean? The image that you have of what drinking a glass of water is not the same as actually drinking it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the reason why one of the issues with anxiety is you're imagining something and you're trusting the thing you imagine more so than reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so when somebody tells you, hey, just talk first in class, or talk to that person, work on your social anxiety by exposing yourself, you trust the imaginative version of yourself that fails the social interaction rather than just jumping and diving into it itself.
Exactly. And that's like the point of what I'm saying with self-deprecating is self-preserving. You're like, I am anticipating this interaction potentially going poorly. Even if I feel like 5% chance it goes poorly. If there's a 5% chance then I'm going to slap myself in order to prevent that 5% chance from happening. And it gives people a sense of comfort. It's like, I've made fun of myself.
Yeah.
So now now we're good, and I can continue on interacting with people. The possibility of someone being mean to you, now that is intolerable. So I'm just going to shit on myself instead.
It's very well said. Very well said.
The slap bet, though, that's always been in the back of my head when talking about anxiety, because it's like the pain itself is so secondary. The pain itself is so secondary to the monsters we create in our head about what the pain will feel like. And then that drives our behavior. You know, I'm going to avoid this and avoid that. And hopefully I never experience the pain that I'm predicting I will feel in my head. But if you, and that's the difference between, you know, the cold plunge, right? The difference between what will it feel like versus I'm actually experiencing it. Most people who do a cold plunge, the second they're in the water, become more relaxed.
Exactly. That's me.
Mm-hmm. That's everyone.
The moment I'm in it, it
that's
feels
not
great.
just you. That's everyone.
No, it's just me. Everybody else, yeah, no, that's a perfect.
There
full
is
circle.
no anxiety unless there is uncertainty you're creating a problem out of. If there would be no anxiety if I could flip a switch and the human race would be okay with whatever uncertainty comes into their experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second you become not okay with it in any way is the second you start to develop anxiety. And it doesn't have to just be ruminative. It doesn't have to be neck up. It could be neck down, you know, like there's trichotillomania, hair pulling, you know, skin picking, you know, biting your fingernails, clenching your jaw. Anxiety can exist in a lot of ways, but the main theme of it is I am recoiling from the present. In some way, I'm escaping the present, whether it's in my mind thinking things or it's in my body contracting in some way.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of the reason why, you know, people with anxiety experience a lot less positive outcomes. So people who think about worst case scenarios and are planning ahead all the time actually experience worst outcomes than people who are optimistic. And there's been studies talking about this. And part of the reason is because if you prepare and brace yourself for a negative version of reality, then you recreate the circumstances that could lead that to happen. But people who think about the best case scenarios more often than the worst case scenarios, they allow themselves to even create that situation itself. Because how can you create a positive situation if you haven't even thought about one of the scenarios that could lead to it? Mm-hmm. And that's not the point of dealing with anxiety. You want to let go of control, but it's just so interesting that when people pursue controlling reality, it actually can lead to negative outcomes for reality.
Here's the problem, though, with anxious people. Their goal is to feel less uncertainty. And thinking positive outcomes, while empirically will lead to better outcomes, is inherently exposing. You're not protecting. I mean, I'm talking from the perspective of our minds, which is false. But you're not protecting yourself when you're thinking of positive outcomes. You're only protecting yourself when you're thinking of negative outcomes. I mean, think of pretend you're like a king of medieval land with a castle, right? And you're like, how do we protect ourselves more? Let's build a moat, right? You're creating more protection by thinking of the negative scenarios. You're not going to be thinking of, you're not protecting yourself by thinking of positive outcomes. The difference is that most of the time we're not being invaded by armies from a different land.
Yeah.
You know, the reality is we're not actually in danger. The root cause of anxiety is a misunderstanding of the danger you're in.
Exactly.
You're not actually in danger, and your mind is unaware of that. So the real question is how can you, in moments when your mind becomes identified with danger, can you recognize that you're not in it?
Yeah.
That's the real question. And it's very hard for people, especially intellectual people, who tend to retreat into their thinking whenever they're anxious. They find so much comfort and familiarity with these very, very well-trodden on pathways of thinking. It's like when I feel anxious, I start thinking of worst case scenarios. It's like a ritual. It's a ritual that they know and are familiar with, and familiarity somehow has more gravitational pull than doing something that might actually help, which is, well, what if things go well?
And that's rituals build up over time. And that's why if you have a lot of anxiety, you oftentimes have a lot of health concerns. So you're trying to use fear to give you positive outcomes. But what happens with fear is that it trains your body, not just your mind, it trains your body to prepare for the worst case scenarios. So if you are running from a lion, it's not beneficial for you to be digesting the Eggo waffle you had this morning.
That's what you had this morning?
No. But I mean, if you're still trying to run away from a threat, you're preparing your body. And if you were being chased by a lion, it would be effective for you not to have a good digestive system because you need to constantly be on the run. So people with fears, they're like, well, at least I'm prepared if a lion were chasing me. But what's really happening is you're robbing yourself of existing when there's positive possible things happening, and your body's keeping track too. And a lot of people with anxiety and health concerns that don't realize the connection, that will start to compound their issues. So if they have social anxiety, they're like, well, I can't really go out because I'm worried that my stomach issues will come up again, or I'll start to experience my panic symptoms. And so then the symptoms become the reason why you don't go and beat that anxiety. And so a lot of times you have to be very careful. Of course, consult your healthcare professional. But at the same time, you really want to keep a good eye on your health concerns and how it relates to anxiety, because that can keep you trapped too.
And that's why the remedy to anxiety at its core is, how can I be okay with whatever happens? Because if my stomach starts hurting, that's okay, as long as I'm okay with whatever happens. The second you stop being okay with whatever happens is the second you start avoiding. And the second you start avoiding is the second it starts to become a conditioned response. And something about our brains, when we start to have conditioned responses, like, for instance, there's something about conditioning that we forget was conditioned, and then it feels really organic. Like, this is just who I am. It's like having fear of abandonment is just who you are. Or was it something that was conditioned in you over repeated exposures to maybe someone's emotional availability coming and going, and now it feels natural to you? That's not who you are.
Right. You can become somebody different.
You can undo that.
You can do something and not become something different, but undo that, like you said. And that could be a good topic too to make sure we hit on, because I think a lot of people are curious about that. But how do you work on anxiety? And one of the ways I think is, a lot of people will come to me and say, well, you're telling me to reduce my anxiety by trying new things. But what if I'm too scared to do that and I can't take the first step? And what I'll have people do is I'll say, well, keep track of the situation that you're trying to change. Try. If you fail and you don't do it, just jot down that experience and challenge the thoughts that kept you stuck. And as you're doing that, you're building a new process in your mind of imagining what could possibly go right. And that won't work for a week. You know, you won't change your behavior probably for a week or so, depending on what you're trying to do. But I mean, think about athletes who are training for events. Like, you don't tell someone who's training to lift like 400 pounds, like, eat a steak on the day of the lift. You're like, no, eat a steak every day and lift lighter weight so that you can prepare for that event. But people with social anxiety, they're like, well, you're telling me to go talk in front of a big group of people as an exposure exercise. So, but I just can't do that, because when I go up there, I'm paralyzed. So I'm stuck for the rest of my life. I'm like, no, you've trained your reptilian part of your mind over time to not feel comfortable doing that. So now we have to find slow ways by challenging your thoughts, shifting your behaviors where you feel a little bit more comfortable. And that's why they create fear hierarchies and things like that. But that's one strategy that I think is really effective if you're
I
trying to
totally
work
agree.
with anxiety.
I totally agree. And the slow ways thing, I think, is super important, because I think when people are trying to work on their anxiety, like I said, your mind is going to try and creatively fuck with you as much as possible because it wants to stay where it is. Your mind wants you to stay stuck. If you know, Nike is just do it, our egos are like, stay stuck. But so your mind wants you to stay stuck. So I come to Jacob, the therapist, and I say, I want to work on my anxiety. And you're like, great, let's do these things. And your mind's like, okay, how can we get him to stay stuck here? Let's make the goal super lofty in the beginning so that if the goal is to speak to a crowd, let's just go straight to speak to a crowd, as opposed to taking a stepwise approach of first talk to the barista at your coffee shop, right? Our minds actually, when we are trying to actually improve our life, sometimes create goals that are unattainable at first and use the failure as an excuse of not trying. Have you noticed that?
I think so too. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's like for instance, I want to play basketball on my high school basketball team. It's like, well, okay, what does that look like though? Well, it looks like every day doing a little bit more and a little bit more. If your goal is to be Michael Jordan the first time you touch a basketball, then I would argue you're setting yourself up to maintain a state of avoidance. You're setting yourself up to fail because you're not giving yourself an opportunity to actually grow into the behavior you're looking to attain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, another way that you could work towards beating anxiety is like challenging how you're using the other emotions too. So if you're trying to beat anxiety and you're trying to beat anxiety with more anxiety, that's not going to work, you know. And you like you're saying, you have to prepare ahead of time to. It's like you have to prepare in the right ways, but not in the wrong ways.
Anxiety is this, and if you're trying to this your way out of this, you've completely misunderstood the point.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really big thing too. But like your body is responding to your anxiety all the time, and if you are constantly clenching your fist and you're tightening your shoulders and you're preparing for like something negative to happen, then that's going to slowly impact your posture and all sorts of things. But that's just really it's just really frustrating to try to beat that when you're already kind of in it. But yeah, it's clenching up,
white knuckling your way through everything.
Yeah,
is a recipe for just constantly feeling like it's not worth it. Like your idea of like if you can't, I also think like if you can't picture yourself handling something differently, then how are you ever going to handle something differently? Like you have to have an idea of, well, what does it look like? And if your idea of what it looks like for instance, if your social anxiety, if your idea of what it looks like is like, I'm going to be James Bond walking throughout a party, well, that's not, if that's your goal, you're going to come up short. But if your goal is, I'm going to be okay with however things go, then all of a sudden you actually regain a sense of control that you convince yourself you didn't have, but it was always there. You know, you can't control how cool you come across, but you can control how okay you are with whatever happens.
Yes, and that's got to be the starting point, because you helped me out in a lot of ways with that. But self-consciousness is the thing that can get you stuck in anxiety. And so a lot of times when people will say, well, how do I fix my anxiety? How do I fix my anxiety so my performance gets better? And I'll say, well, that's the problem. You don't want to enhance your performance yet. What you want to do is you want to stop judging your performance. That's where you start. Because the moment you start judging your performance, you're engaging in the behavior of self-consciousness. And you're asking me, hey, Dr. J, how do I get rid of my self-consciousness? And you're telling me that your strategy to get rid of self-consciousness is self-consciousness. So I'm saying, stop thinking about yourself.
That's using this to solve this. Like,
exactly.
It's fighting fire with fire.
And then the moment you stop doing that, of course, it's not easy at first because you're like, well, I'm still in my head, Dr. J. Like, I've been trying to fix this, and so the issue is that you haven't just had a whole lot of practice, but just like you're saying, you have to start at the foundation with, I am who I am, and that's enough. Because if you start anywhere else, then you're going to have to keep that up in order to maintain whatever you think is good.
There's nothing wrong with being self-conscious. It's about making a problem out of anything. You know, like it's just like the Zen story in the beginning. If you're afraid, be afraid. If you're in your head for this moment, be in your head. There were a couple of times filming this podcast briefly where I noticed myself paying attention to like, oh, did that sound good? And then what's the solution though? The solution is not more thinking. The solution is come back into the room.
Yeah.
And that is not a very comfortable feeling for someone whose prior solutions have always been finding more answers in here.
Yeah.
Bringing yourself back. Even if you have to do it 100 times over the course of an hour, you're building the muscle of becoming more present even if that sense of presence sucks.
Yeah.
You know, like I was saying, when I was dealing with kidney stones, I try to practice presence. It's not always successful, but in moments where I am completely just allowing the pain to exist, it's a lot less unpleasant.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I think anger is so helpful in dealing with anxiety, because it pushes you into the present. Anxiety is what's going on, where are all the obstacles? How can I figure this out? Anger is a gamble. And that's why people give anger a hard rep a whole lot of times, because anger is the emotion that's impulsive, it's reckless, and people regret a lot of stuff they do when they're angry. And so that's a negative side of it, but that's the price of anger. It's something that's a little reckless. You don't know what's going to happen, but you're going to exist. And you have to let that happen too, because anger is a reckless emotion, and it was meant to be that way because it keeps you in the present moment. And then the moment you jump into the present moment with anger, you'll notice that, and a lot of people with anxiety will tell you this, but if the moment that somebody pushes them enough to the point where they get angry enough, then they start to perform well. And then they start to be a great basketball player, or they begin to speak well in front of people because they've been pushed over the edge. And they don't even question it. But the reason is because you're finally participating. Those obstacles that you thought were not worth ignoring in order to exist are worth ignoring, because now you realize that I've been pushed to the edge and I'm willing to gamble now. They pushed me over the edge. And then everything works out so much more effectively than it would have had they continued with their anxiety.
This is what's frustrating to me about the modern conversation about masculinity, is that there's not really a good concept of what positive masculinity looks like, but toxic masculinity always has anger involved. Like there's no scenario where being angry or having anger in you is something that can be helpful or a signpost towards something else. And the truth is, most men probably experience an excessive amount of anger, but just because it's an excessive amount of anger doesn't mean that a moderate amount of anger wouldn't be something they could utilize. It could be a tool to illustrate something about their external world that maybe they're not aware of. Like if I'm constantly getting angry, maybe someone's pushing my boundaries. If I'm using anger as a motivator, maybe you can replace it sometimes with something else, but it also propels you into a successful career or something. Like there's nothing wrong with your natural experience. It's really just what you do with it. If your anger is used to hurt other people, then that's a different story. But I think there's no space for anger in the modern world to be depicted as anything but negative. And I think that's a shame, especially for men and boys who don't really feel comfortable having it, but it's still there.
Yeah, yeah. And you're saying something that you talked about with anxiety too, but every form of anger can be healthy. Rage can be healthy. Frustration can be healthy. Fine-tune motivation and hyperfocus. And I mean, people will say, well, how? But it's if you're being pushed off a cliff, like you said, and somebody's pushing your boundary, I say it'd be weird if you weren't really rageful in pushing them back, or if somebody was about to hurt your kids and threatening them. It'd be weird if you were like, oh, that's fine. Because a lack of anger is a lack of care about what's important to you. So the moment you start to classify anger as a very unhealthy emotion on all levels, that's the moment that you start to take away everything someone cares about.
You shouldn't judge any emotions. Like emotions are not something you're choosing. And this is what I have to tell clients all the fucking time. I'm like, your emotions are a byproduct of the experiences you're having. You're not choosing to feel sad when a relative dies. You're sad because you're experiencing loss. You're not choosing any of that, you know? And so the second you start judging your emotional experiences, the second you stop connecting with your physical experience, you know?
Boom. Yeah. Physical experience. And that's something that gets really messed up if you don't have anger. Because if you're suppressing anger, then you're suppressing desire and physical connection with people around you. Like you're no longer experiencing. So people will wonder, like, why am I not experiencing a lot of dopamine in life? Why am I not happy? And a lot of times it's because you're not angry enough. You're not connecting with people at a very physical level when it comes to your emotions. And this is kind of random too, but I think this is why people who aren't very angry can be very boring people. I mean, think about it. Because if you're suppressing your anger, which is the emotion that gets rid of the obstacles between you and what you care about, then if you suppress anger all the time, nobody's going to see you living out your passions and the things you care about, because that's included under that umbrella. So the moment that you suppress anger, that's the moment that you suppress the dopamine you get from pursuing it. And then you'd also suppress the ability for other people to connect with you on that level.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're always just like pausing and you're not really engaging in the world that the way you really want to, it robs everybody else of the opportunity to be present with the you that is ready to just let everything loose and just be yourself, you know?
It's also the moment you start modifying your self-worth to accommodate other people. Like if if you're like, I tell clients all the time, not that I'm looking for this, but I like when they're angry with me, because I'm an imperfect person and sometimes I'm not handling things the best I can, or maybe I'm not being sensitive enough here, and they go, I'm mad at you. You didn't really consider this thing. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. Like, and then I take accountability and I demonstrate that I'm capable of taking accountability. And it's like, oh, so in this scenario, what anger served as, it was a way for you to repair your relationship with me. And because I acknowledged your hurt and took accountability for the role I played, we can move on and have an even better relationship than we had before, because now it's tested and it's stronger. Now you have an idea of, oh, I can be upset with this person and we could and it'll be fine. But you'll never know that if you're never angry. That's why when like a couple, we've all met a couple of couples that are like this, but when you meet a couple and you hear one of them say like, we've never fought. We've been together for 2 years. And I'm like, that's a fucking problem. I mean, I won't say that, but I'll think it. And it's a problem because it's like, oh, so neither of you have ever expressed frustration to the other one because maybe you don't feel confident enough in your relationship to last through it. That's a problem. Maybe your sense of your relationship is not as secure as you think if you're protecting it from conflict.
Yeah, I mean, mic drop, man. That's every word for word. Everything.
Which is a fear-based thing. Going back to the theme of anxiety, you're actually a couple that never fights and has never fought ever is a couple that lives in constant fear of what happens when you express anger.
Yes. Like you said, and there's a lot of people that say this, but a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm just one of those people that never get angry. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, that's a real problem.
You do this look at them?
Yeah.
Like that like Steve Harvey look?
Yeah. I'm like, that's a real problem, because that just goes to show that you don't have anything worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
So if your partner is
you don't feel like it's worth fighting for.
Exactly, because they are worth fighting for.
Of course.
And every human is. And so if you're in a relationship and you don't ever get angry, then you're saying in the long run, you're not worth fighting for, because inevitably there's going to be conflict.
Or I'm not worth fighting for. Like if I never get angry, it's like maybe I don't feel worthy enough to have needs.
Right. Yeah. You're suppressing yourself and you're thinking, well, I'm not worthy of existing. I'm just repeating what you said. Yeah.
Well,
it was good. Oh man.
It was good stuff, right?
That was.
We have like 10 minutes.
Let's think about some closing statements here. I mean, we covered a lot and we accidentally started talking about anger, I think, because they're all connected.
Well, okay, I wanted to say this last thing about anger too. I kind of look at anger more as a secondary emotion rather than a primary emotion.
Interesting.
I feel like anger is more of a tool to help reinforce or protect some other experience. Like, for instance, one aspect of sadness, let's say you're going through grief and you're experiencing sadness, a lot of that sometimes is the experience of anger. Like, I'm mad that this person is leaving, or anger serves a self-preservation function in other contexts. Like it's always like I often find if you're an angry person, anger is the layer that you're experiencing consciously, but underneath anger is probably the emotion that you're perpetuating by not going into it. Like if you're constantly angry and never sad, you probably have a hard time accepting some aspects of reality.
Interesting.
It keeps you from accepting some aspects of reality. If you're constantly angry with your spouse because they're not X, and then all of a sudden you come to the acceptance of them not being X, you're not going to be angry with them anymore. You're going to be sad. Like, oh, you're never going to be this thing. That makes me sad. As opposed to, coming to terms with something. Yeah, I guess I said what I said.
Yeah, I mean,
Did I? You're thinking.
I'm thinking about what you're saying because I feel like there's some disagreement with the primary secondary thing already, but but I can see the connection with like because it's really nuanced because it's like you have from my conceptualization, pleasure instinct and you have the avoidance instinct, and so when you're thinking about the primary secondary, that I think is what sets up the groundwork for reality for yourself. So I like security, therefore I'm going to seek that out, or I like power. And then once you have fear, sadness, and anger destroying obstacles, you organize those emotions based on your pain pleasure instincts. So it's like you can have a positive feeling of fear of missing out on an opportunity because you know that could lead you to your pleasure. But then you can also have a avoidance area with fear when you're avoiding obstacles that might take you down to hell. But when it comes to anger, it's the same thing of like, well, now I'm going to identify, but I'm going to use anger to destroy the things that's going to bring me towards
But anger's
my
a tool
goal.
in that conceptualization, is it not?
But I feel like both fear is the identification and anger is the destruction force. It's the go button. It's the move. So both fear and anger, I think, are high energy emotions for a reason.
But I don't think fear. I think anxiety is the identification. I think fear is just a natural physiological response to perceived danger. Like fear is anxiety is where it gets caught in your head, but fear is I'm in danger.
Well, do you think there's a healthy function to imagining things in your head?
Well, I feel like recognizing the difference between something that's in your head and something that's in real life is if you can successfully do that 100% of the time, you'll never feel anxiety. Because if I'm in danger, then I should be feeling fear. But if I'm not in danger, then I shouldn't be feeling fear.
Interesting.
It's that simple. But the problem is that when we're anxious, we fail to recognize we're not in danger.
Yeah. And I mean, this just goes to show that there's different theories of emotion. There's the James Lange, there's a two-factor theory. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're describing is one of the theories of emotion. If I classify them now, I could be wrong, so I don't want to embody that. But I think I'm more like James Lange. Mm-hmm. But I do think that fear is an umbrella that encompasses the imagination as well. I don't feel like that's completely symptomatic. It could lead to anxiety, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas fear is identifying things and feeling it in the moment. Like you said, if you were in Florida during a hurricane, I think it would be effective to imagine a million things that could go wrong because there are a million things that could go wrong to help you escape.
But once you've done that,
mm-hmm.
once you've boarded up every window and there's nothing left to do, is your mind going to stop going? Probably not. My conceptualization of emotions is more. There's this researcher named Nico Frida.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how emotions are a combination of our appraisal, so a cognitive appraisal of the situation matched
Mm-hmm.
with the action tendency of the physiological experience. So if you appraise danger, then the action potential tendency that comes from that is what fear is. Mm-hmm. So I'm in danger, I'm feeling fear. So there's it's basically neck up plus neck down.
Interesting.
But neck down is completely predicated on the way you perceive neck up. So if you feel like you're in danger, you're going to feel fear. If you don't feel like you're in danger, you're not going to feel fear. Once you develop memories of fearful experiences, then anxiety becomes possible because now you become cued into feeling fear when fear is not present. You're anticipating fear.
Interesting.
Anxiety to me is anticipating fear. Anxiety to me is trying to seek peace in the future rather than the present because you've given up on the present being a peaceful experience.
I see. And that's where we divide because I think fear includes imagining obstacles that are effective to imagine. And because I was, when you mentioned the hurricane thing, I thought, well, yeah, it would, fear in its most effective place would notice the obstacles and then would shift over to anger to taking action. You wouldn't keep dwelling on things that you couldn't change, even though that would be difficult. And I mean, fear would look like intensifying the moment that obstacles start to accumulate in your mind. But I think that's the divide where for you, that's
mine's
specific
more like
part.
simplified of like fear is just I throw a ball at your head and that's what you feel.
Yeah. Whereas I think
anxiety is he going to throw a ball again? I hope he doesn't throw a ball again. You know what I mean?
And I see that as strategic. And I feel like anxiety.
It might be. I mean, I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not useful.
Yeah.
Like if we didn't use our past experiences of if we didn't use our past experiences that didn't go well to inform the way we navigate our future, then we're actively kind of going to step in dog shit by not looking on the ground when we're walking.
Right.
But how much are you keeping your head down when you walk your dog? If it's a lot, then you're
That's anxiety.
consumed by it.
And so would you say the effective part of that is anxiety, or would you say that?
Well, I don't think
Would
the
you- or-
effectiveness of it changes the definition.
Or is there a good anxiety
I don't really think it's
or effective anxiety?
within the realm of judgment. I think I just think it's more like if you're using the problem with anxiety is you're never using it, it's using you. Like you're never in the driver's seat when you're feeling anxious. And that I think is a big factor to determine if your anxiety is being effective or not. Like if you're driving that car, then you get to decide when you stop thinking about this thing. But if you're not driving that car, you're not going to stop thinking about it simply because you're kind of tired of thinking about it.
That's another divide, because I've always thought that anxiety is always problematic fear. And fear is when anxiety is not problematic. It's not anxiety yet. But that makes sense, what you're saying.
I guess it doesn't matter because I feel like the way we talk about this, we're
on the same
talking
page.
about this. Yeah. This is just like locker room talk for therapists.
Yeah. But it's kind of cool for people to see, I think.
That's a good podcast title. Locker room talk for therapists.
We're going to get kicked out, or what's the word when you get canceled?
I'm going to get you to 100,000 followers and then I'm going to cancel you.
No. I think about that a lot. I'm like, I'm going to get canceled because I said something.
And it's going to be me who's going to do it.
You're going to make a burner profile. I'm already looking. I was like, could this be Vinny? I really had that thought. And I was like, nah.
It's like not Vinny.
Yeah.
58.
Close this out, man. What
Go
you
Jets. It was nice talking to you in this very legit studio.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably, we live in the age of anxiety, so it was an important conversation to have. And I'm sure that from this conversation will be constant comments of like, so what do we fucking do? And it's like, my answer, stop being anxious. Like, just get over it.
Nike, just do it.
Just get over it already.
Rewatch
Jesus.
episode 4 over and over and over again.
Just get over it. Like, stop being anxious. Doesn't that work? Does that not work for you?
It works, man. You just got to stop it. Just stop it. We should have just said, just stop it the whole hour.
Just over and over again. That'd be so funny.
Well, I mean, next episode, you got any ideas yet? I was thinking around, I don't know, either attachment or something else. I had another
attachment.
thought.
That's good.
You think so?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I like that. Somebody else was like, you should talk about bipolar, but I was like, that could be wrapped up.
That is so
like
niche. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it is.
Way too niche. Let's talk about obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Jesus, it's going to apply to like 6 people.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having us, and we'll see you guys soon.
See you soon. Have a good life.
Awful ending.
Everything I do introductory